Alright, we all know the story how Vince McMahon took his father's regional wrestling promotion, the then WWF, rebranded it the WWF, and proceeded to take over the world. Well, in a manner of speaking. Vince would inevitably become the titan of the industry, taking his company national, then international, building an empire. It's all well known. However, in order for any of this to happen, Vince would have to eliminate the competition. Sounds dark. During the 80s, Vince took out almost everybody, systematically, mercilessly, decisively. Employing an effective formula for success, Vince would begin promoting shows in rival territories, sometimes on the same night and in the same city as his rivals, cutting into their revenue and shrinking their fan base. Adding to that, Vince would then attempt, successfully most of the time, to either take over competitors' television spots and push them out, eliminating his rivals' ability to advertise and promote themselves while promoting himself. And finally, his most gangster move, he would steal the talent from other promotions. Most famously, Hulk Hogan from AWA. In short, Vince would show up, say, "I'm not here to negotiate, I'm here to buy you out." If the promoter tried to fight it, he 9 times out of 10 lost. And Vince took over anyway. The professional wrestling version of get down or lay down. I think Beans approves. Now, during this conquest of wrestling, Vince took out all of his rivals. The AWA, gone. Los Angeles, took over. Calgary, took over, etc., etc. The majority of Southern wrestling promotions would wind up being owned by Crockett Promotions, who unfortunately couldn't manage and later sold to Ted Turner to become WCW, thus bringing an end to the territory era of wrestling in favor of new national giant promotions, an equivalent to the big corporation taking over the family business. However, one man did not go down so easily. One lone promoter would manage to hold his own against Vince in his own way, and when it seemed inevitable that Vince was taking over, this one man was able to make a deal that best suited him, and in a beautiful final play, was able to stick his thumb in Vince's eye on the way out. And this man was Paul Boesch. Now a quick history of Paul Boesch for those who may not be aware. Paul Boesch began wrestling in the 1930s. He would put his wrestling career on hold in order to enlist in the Army during World War II. Becoming a first lieutenant and serving in the 121st Infantry Regiment of the 8th Infantry Division, earning several decorations, and upon returning home, he would go back to wrestling. But unfortunately, in 1947, he would be forced to retire from in-ring action due to a car accident. Then owner Morris Siegel would keep Boesch employed, allowing him to become Houston Wrestling's first television commentator. And after Morris Siegel passed away in 1966, Boesch would buy Houston Wrestling himself, running it until his retirement in 1987. Unfortunately, Paul Boesch would pass away in 1989, leaving behind a legacy that's still intact to this very day, and after this story, you will understand why. Now, back to Vince's rise to power. The year is 1987. Vince had been promoting shows in Houston previous to this, but now he's trying to win. Paul Boesch decides rather than losing his life's work, he would sign with WWF. Vince will start recording television programs in Houston, let Boesch use any WWF matches he likes on Houston TV, including WrestleMania matches, and finally, Vince and Paul would co-promote in Houston together. Sounds like a good deal, right? It only lasted 4 months, if that. On the first card, 7 WWF wrestlers would no-show, thus calling for 7 substitutions in one night. This was completely unacceptable, as Paul Boesch hadn't had 7 substitutions on one card in the history of Houston wrestling. Now, soon after this, the WrestleMania rematch between Randy Savage and Ricky Steamboat was booked in Houston. Paul Boesch at this point in time made some interesting decisions. A few weeks before the event, he would air the Randy Savage vs. Ricky Steamboat WrestleMania match in its entirety. The next week, he would air it again, and the next week, air it yet again. This would dilute the interest in the match, leading to an abysmal turnout for the card. Vince McMahon, upon finding out about this, was less than amused. He would first put Bruce Pritchard in charge of all television in Houston, and would begin demanding that everything be passed by him for approval. To add to all that, after the poor turnout for the WrestleMania rematch, live show attendance continued to dwindle, even with WWF sending talent. This was a problem in the eyes of Paul Boesch, who would go to Vince in Connecticut and renegotiate their deal. That went as follows. To deal with the gates that were not drawing, Vince would pay off Paul Bosch's debts he needed paid off. Paul Bosch would agree to turn the Houston ticket office into a Ticketmaster outlet and promote events other than wrestling. Also, Paul Bosch and his nephew would be put on salary and would take on some of the responsibilities for promoting for WWF. Apparently, there was some sort of miscommunication, or it is at this point Paul had had enough. According to Bruce Pritchard, Vince agreed to put Paul on a salary in order to get him to handle some of the responsibilities for promoting and running Houston. Paul Bosch was under the impression that he was being paid so Vince could run Houston. Either way, Paul was getting money and not running Houston. Vince at this point lost patience. To him, he was paying Paul to run Houston, but he was still having to run it himself. Vince had taken care of Paul's financial woes and was paying him, and in return, he felt that Paul hadn't kept his end of the deal. So, Vince being Vince, ended it. He would call Paul Bosch and inform him the deal was off, and he'll be running Houston himself without Paul Bosch. Now, at this point in time, Paul Bosch had closed down Houston Wrestling. All his debts had been taken care of. He had been receiving a salary from Vince. And it was at this point Paul Bosch made his final move against Vince. His nephew, Peter Burkholz, would call Vince shortly after Vince informed them of the cancellation of their deal. Peter told Vince Paul wanted to retire. He wanted to do one more show to quote-unquote go out in style. Then he would retire. Vince agreed. On August 28, 1987, at the Sam Houston Coliseum in front of a sellout crowd of 12,000, they did the Paul Bosch Retirement Show, an immense success. Wrestling legends such as Vern Gagne, Stu Hart, Ernie Ladd, and many others were in attendance and would make appearances. The vice president at the time, George Bush, would send a telegram commending and praising the life and career of Paul Bosch. And the event would boast a main event, Hulk Hogan versus the One Man Gang, for the WWF World Championship, with Hogan winning. Vince McMahon would pay all the talent for the show, all travel expenses and accommodations, and even had an after party in Paul Bosch's honor. He rather literally spared no expense, and the show was an overwhelming success. With a sellout gate, Paul Bosch had been sent out in style. Afterwards, Vince would have a meeting with Paul. However, rather uncharacteristically, Vince was late. Upon arriving for his meeting, Vince was informed that Paul had already left, but his nephew Peter was there for the meeting. During the meeting, the gate for the sellout retirement show was balled up. Now, traditionally, Vince would split shows with local promoters 70-30, Vince keeping the 70. However, on this occasion, Peter had asked beforehand what was the split going to be, and Vince had replied, "I'll be fair." Well, Vince had no idea how fair he was about to be. At the meeting, when the gate was bought up, Vince asked about the split, and it was at this moment Paul's final move against Vince came full circle. Peter Burkholz looked at Vince McMahon with Bruce Pritchard sitting right there and said, "Paul feels it would be fair if he kept the gate. Let that sink in." Paul Bosch, who had been in the wrestling business for most of his life and had been a successful promoter for over 20 years, did what no one else was ever able to do: get over on Vince McMahon. When Vince started his expansion into the Houston territory, rather than fight, Paul got on board. His first jab was watering down the rematch between Randy Savage and Ricky Steamboat, while at the same time giving away WrestleMania matches for free on broadcast television, which he had to know would lead to smaller crowds and thus less money. Once that happened, he then managed to get Vince to pay off all his remaining debts, leaving him free and clear, and even managed to get a salary out of the deal, all while, according to some people, not doing what he and Vince had agreed he should do, in effect working against Vince. And when it seemed like the end, Paul managed to get Vince to pay for him to have a retirement show. But his final move had to be the best, getting and keeping all the money from the sellout retirement show, the proverbial thumb in the eye. Paul Bosch, the only man to get over on Vince. So I'm sorry about that long stretch between videos. I'm Walt, the most gangster nerd on YouTube, and I'll be seeing you soon enough.